Today's topic is going to be zoning and EVs, but do you mind if we just do a quick round of introductions here towards the beginning of the presentation? I just wanted to make sure that our experts have a sense of, who's all online right now.
Sure. We could start here. Adam Altsberg, with the Fargo-Moorhead Metropolitan Council of Governments.
Okay. We can do the team next. So I'm John Mart. I've been project manager, compatriot with Adam on this one on the HDR side, and we're just coming to the tail end of this EV readiness study. And I'm going to hand it to Justin Robbins quick also from HDR.
Hi, everybody. Justin Robbins, HDR. I'm our national planning lead for EV infrastructure. And related to the specific area, I'm the program manager for North Dakota's NEVI program and also worked with Minnesota on that NEVI program as well. So glad to be here.
And Laura?
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Lambley, also with HDR. I'm a zero emissions planner based in our Madison, Wisconsin office. And I've supported a little bit with this project earlier, helping come up with the best practice recommendations that we sent out for zoning. So happy to get into a little bit more detail with everyone today.
And then on the phone lines, maybe Leslie, could you introduce yourself quick?
Leslie McElroy-Rivas, Senior Planner, City West Fargo.
Thank you. And Kevin, would you be able to introduce yourself one more time?
Good afternoon, Kevin Gordon with the City of Fargo Engineering Department.
Awesome. And Cole, if you don't mind coming off mute and saying hello.
Cole Hansen, Cass County Planning.
Awesome. This is going to make my job easy. I am mostly here to, frame this all in the study. And I'm going to give a brief project overview, but, we have the turnout who are to this meeting live, or, all folks who are on our state review committee. So you guys will be up to speed on these, but let's talk about the project at a very high level as to why this conversation was important for the COG and I to help get scheduled. Obviously, for the Fargo-Moorhead area, we were looking at EV readiness with a more tactical 10-year planning timeframe. And the biggest thing that we did to start out was gather data on EV registrations. But since we know that that's not a mature aspect of the vehicle fleet yet, it's growing, that we needed to marry that with some projections. So as we look at accommodating EV growth in the Fargo-Moorhead region, we've looked at 900 EVs in 2024 being closer to 11 to 18,000 in 2035 for registered EVs. Obviously, EVs require charging infrastructure. A lot of that is going to be at the household use, but we know that not all households are the same either. So we've used nationally respected tools from the National Renewable Energy Labs in order to come up with a number of charging ports that is broken out by single family or kind of private use, multifamily, and then just openly publicly accessible. Project did come up with some recommendations for the faster charging as well, both for community uses, and then we spoke about the work that Justin spoke of before that North Dakota DOT is looking at for filling gaps for a national EV charging plan. So again, that a lot of what we're talking about today will impact how and where those 900 to 1,300 charging ports could go for the multifamily, and how and where that 1,600 to 1,900 public accessible ports might go. One of the other products of the study was to look at making EV charging siting decisions by their likely use. And so our team has been working quite a few places and pulled in different best practices, but for those publicly accessible chargers, we have laid out some categories or typology of all of those places they might be. So there's community charging, commercial destination charging. So as you can see from that little picture snippet, that's more like your standard paved lot with charging infrastructure added, workplace destination charging, distance destination charging. So that's where we would start to see kind of a new style of land use where, maybe a lot that is specific for having fast chargers nearby might pop up, or it could be, just more of an amenity there. And then depot charging, and that's something that would support our vehicles that are on kind of standard fixed routes. So this has been a major product of the study. It's a tool to be used beyond the end of the study horizon, but it really looks at marrying up EV use with those demand estimates that we projected on the last slide. So, overall project goals align metropolitan area regional goals with this growing shift to EVs, open a dialogue between city and regional leaders, along with other key aspects of the EV ecosystem, which include our utilities for providing, our public users, and then we're going to need site hosts or business partners who install a lot of this, and then provide actionable recommendations. And that last one is what we kind of came to this meeting around, is that there's 8 high priority recommendations that have come out of the study, 4 of which fall into the typical duties of comp planning and rezoning. And so a lot of this presentation is built around these 4 high priority strategies that are listed: updating zoning codes and permitted use tables to include EVSE, which is our charging equipment, develop building code requirements and update parking minimums around EV use, develop charging site standards and share them with charging providers, and create a density bonus to multifamily developers, adding charging stations to parking. So from here, I'm going to hand it to our 2 experts. But yeah, this is just kind of an important stage setting part to talk about the basics of EVs. So I'm gonna hand it to Justin Robbins here to take it.
Hi everybody. So I don't know exactly when we have an audience exactly who's got experience in this and who doesn't. So unfortunately, if you own an EV, if you already know these things, then this is probably old hat for you. But in the case that you don't, I just wanted to try and draw some base level understanding of what we're going to be talking about. So when we talk about EVs, generally we're talking about what's on the left-hand side, which is a battery electric vehicle. And that's really where the energy source only comes from electricity or from the grid or from a plug, basically. So it doesn't take fuel in any way outside of that electrical connection. There are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which are PHEVs, and that's where it does have kind of a range extender that runs on petroleum. And then there is a smaller electric battery that then powers the vehicle, potentially up for 30, 40, 50 miles, depending on the vehicle itself. And then you have ones that are hybrid that you cannot plug in at all. And essentially, it generates electricity when you use the brakes to stop it and then uses that back for acceleration. And really, what that is intended to do is to increase the overall miles per gallon of the vehicle. A majority of the vehicles that are going to be on the road that we talk about in terms of electric vehicle adoption are on the left-hand side. And when we talk about things like DC fast charging, that really only applies to the one on the left. It is very rare, if at all, to have a plug-in hybrid that can use fast charging. So keep that in mind. Those vehicles are out there. When you hear PHEV, yes, it's electric. Yes, it can plug in. Yes, it can use level 2, but it's going to be limited for the fast charging and they still use petroleum. So if you want to hit the next slide, Laura. I like to use this for fellow planners, of which I am one. But basically, there's 3 levels of charging. Now, the first 2 are considered what are AC charging, which are level 1 and level 2. We'll get into a little bit of the details on those, but imagine the battery is kind of like a swimming pool. And what you're trying to do is fill up that swimming pool with energy. And so level 1, it's kind of like doing it with a garden hose. Level 2, it's a bit faster. It's kind of like doing it with a fire hose. And then level 3 is where take the governor off and you're basically filling that sucker up with a fire hydrant. So all of these things have consequences for EV charging. We talk about the speed of charging. Number 1, it's going to matter the size of the pool. Number 2, it's going to matter what we're charging it with. Number 3, it's going to matter how much water or energy was in the pool to begin with. So these are all things when we talk about fast charging, it is fast charging if it is a light duty vehicle. and the vehicle has the ability to take a charge that big. It is not fast charging. If it is, you can have the same level of power, but if you're trying to charge like a Class 8 truck or you're trying to charge a bus, it's still going to take a long time because that pool is much, much larger. Those batteries are much bigger, so it just takes more time to fill it up with the energy needed. So in terms of details, what this means, so level 1 and level 2, I mentioned before, these are AC charging, which means they take alternating current from the grid and it drops it into the vehicle. And that vehicle, all the battery electric vehicles on the market have what's called an onboard charger. What that onboard charger does is it takes that alternating current, converts it into DC, and then it drops it into the battery. To some extent, these are really just complicated extension cords. So with a AC level 1, you only find these inside homes. They essentially use a standard convenience outlet, a NEMA 515, 120 volts, and generally it will be, I'm not even sure if you can get a Tesla for it, but it'll add maybe like 1 to 2 miles of range per hour of charging. So if you charge for 12 hours and you drive less than 20 miles a day, that's fine. You don't need an upgrade. Most of the vehicles are going to want a level 2, so you can have a bit more flexibility. It allows you to charge that vehicle a bit quicker. So level 1 is maxes out at 1.2 or 1.9 kilowatts, excuse me. A kilowatt is the measure of power. So consider a kilowatt analogous to the garden hose, right? That's the flow of electricity over time. And 1.9 kilowatts is what we're talking about with level 1. Level 2 is maxes out at 19.2, but those typically operate between 7 and 11 kilowatts. So again, these are what you generally see incorporated into a parking area. Depending on the size of the battery, depending on the state of charge of that battery, it can take anywhere from 4 to 10 hours to charge up the vehicle. And so they're really good for things like at-home charging. You can install permanently in the garage, or it can be with employers or anywhere a vehicle is overlaid for a decent amount of time. And then you get into the realm of what's called DC fast charging. Now, I mentioned before, so AC takes it and dumps it into the onboard charger. What a DC fast charger does is it bypasses that onboard charger and the vehicle plugs in. That DC fast charger is a significant piece of equipment that is very expensive, and it's able to connect with the vehicle, and the vehicle tells it exactly how much power it can accept and at what voltage. So the vehicle saying, DC fast charger, I can take 150 kilowatts at 800 volts right now, and the charger will do that and basically modulate its power output into the vehicle and accommodate whatever the vehicle can take at that time. They all kind of have different curves that they can take electricity and they can take power. And that DC fast charger is able to do that. So those operate, again, level 1, 1.9 kilowatts, level 2, 19.2 maximum. DC fast charging typically starts at about 50 kilowatts and goes all the way up to 350. So there's quite a bit of range there. And this one thing I just want to make clear, the range with those DC fast chargers dictates what the use of those can, should, and will be. So if you go to a car dealership, generally those will be between 50 kilowatts up to maybe 100. So it might take an hour or 2 hours, 2.5 hours to charge that vehicle. It's still fast, but it is not analogous to, let's say, a fueling station. When you get to the 150 and above, 150 is what the minimum standard is for NEVI. And a majority of the chargers that you see being installed today can go up to 300 to 350 kilowatts. And so that's where we get into the realm of basically, for light duty vehicles, those chargers can get a vehicle on the road from 10 to 20 to 30 minutes. Again, there's a lot of variables there with the vehicles themselves, the amount of power that's available, but those are analogous to a fueling station. So just because it says DC fast charger, I understand there's a spectrum. On the lower end, it still is able to be incorporated into kind of parking areas that have, let's say, shorter duration turnarounds, 2 hours or so. And when it's on the higher end, let's say 150 and above, that's when it starts to get into the realm of basically a fueling station where you just have a higher turnover of vehicles that are coming in and out of that space. I'm going to show some pictures of what these look like, and then we'll stop and I'll talk through any questions that you have related to the charging technology and the infrastructure. So these are level 2 chargers. Like I said before, they're kind of glorified extension cords. The circuitry is not complicated. The ones that you see are essentially running off of a dryer outlet, NEMA outlet. They have different levels of power. 7 kilowatts is typical. The ones that you can see in the top right are charge point. Those are for fleets. They would generally have things like payment systems. They have cables attached. They have communications. They have screens, buttons, all that good stuff. These are the kinds of things that cities are typically looking at for chargers. And again, these get coordinated alongside parking. These take a long time in the broad kind of scope of things. So you want to place them in areas where vehicles will be overlaid for a fair amount of time. And really quickly on cost, just to give everybody an understanding. So when we talk about port, if you hear that term, what a port is the ability to charge a single vehicle. So the charger itself might have 2 ports. So the one on the top right, you can see there's 2 cables. There's a 2-port charger, meaning you could take each one of those cables and plug it into a different vehicle. So that's a dual port charger. And then the ones on the bottom left, you can see those have a single cable or a single port. So you can charge only one vehicle at a time with those. And so per port, what you would be looking at in terms of cost, not you necessarily, but to install, own, operate, maintain these are anywhere from $10,000 up to $30,000 per port. The ones on the bottom right, those are wall mounted. Those are much cheaper. But when you get into commercial applications, when you're dealing with potential transformer upgrades, when you're dealing with utility upgrades, when you're dealing with commercial chargers, those can get more expensive just because of the extra work. The other thing to mention is that electrification doesn't have economies of scale. So the more that you have, the further up the upgrade tree you have to go, which means if you have 1 or 2 ports, you can typically do that within an existing service for a building. If you start to go over that and you get to things like maybe 100 kilowatts, for example, if you have multiple ports, let's say you've got 10 of them that you install, well, you might be looking at an upgrade to the building power, depending on the kind of building you're talking about. If you have 20, 30, whatever, then you're looking at something a lot more substantial. So again, with a smaller number, you can keep that kind of an existing capacity. The larger you get and the more powerful you get, the higher up your infrastructure that those upgrades will need to be made. So again, just trying to give everybody an understanding of what we're talking about with costing, and there's a lot that goes into it. So these are very high level estimates that we use on a planning level for per port, but I just want to give everybody an understanding of what we're talking about. We go to the next slide and we'll get a highlight of what a DC charger looks like. So again, these are significant pieces of equipment. The one on the top left, so you have the charger itself, and those cabinets in the back are technically the chargers. And then those pylons that have the cables coming out of them, those are the dispensers. And so these are, you can see the difference between the level 2 and the level 3. These are not cheap. So these will cost anywhere, and we typically do these per kilowatt, from $1,200 per kilowatt all the way up to potentially $2,000 per kilowatt. Again, with a lot of caveats for what that would actually entail, and where you're installing it matters. And there's a bunch of different things that kind of feed into that. So again, just giving everybody an understanding, even the infrastructure itself, dealing with DC fast charger, they're bigger. They're more kind of in your face in terms of visual and aesthetics. They have a higher rate of turnover for vehicles. The more powerful ones you can kind of see as fueling stations in a way. So just trying to give everybody both visually and kind of a base level of understanding of what all this stuff is. So I think this is the last slide we have in this section. I'm going to pause and ask for any questions, clarifications. And my sincere apologies if I'm dealing with a group of EV experts.
Well, I appreciate the background information. So it's all very good. So thank you.
Gladly. Anyone else before we carry on? Okay. So I'm going to kick over to Laura, and she's going to take us through the section of zoning and EVs.
All right, thank you, Justin. So going back a little bit to what John discussed earlier, many of those high priority strategies that came out of this report focused on zoning and building code updates. So we're going to walk through some of those recommended best practices in a little more detail today. And we've got 4 main topics we're going to cover. So the first is removing barriers in the zoning code. Second, developing charging station design standards. Third, making building codes EV ready. And then finally, we're going to provide some examples of density bonuses that other cities have used. So first topic, removing barriers. So going back again to kind of what John introduced, in this study, we had a projected charging need of about 7 to 11,000 total ports by 2035, with about 2,000 of those being publicly accessible ports. That's obviously a really big number. And so in order to help, facilitate that steep increase in charging stations, it's important to make sure that the local zoning codes aren't providing additional barriers to developers. So, one of the most common barriers that we see is those definitions that are included in zoning codes. A lot of jurisdictions haven't updated these yet to provide a separate definition for EV charging that's distinct from gas stations. And when there's not a separate definition, this can result in charging stations technically being subject to those same siting restrictions as a gas station, even though they're obviously not going to have the same environmental hazards and they're complementary with a much wider variety of land uses. So we'll cover, 3 key actions that will remove some of those most common barriers. The first, just, being defining EV charging separately from a gas station. Second, updating that zoning use table to make it clear where charging stations are a permitted use by right and where perhaps there are additional restrictions. And then third, clarifying in your zoning code that EV parking spaces could count towards minimum parking requirements. So again, going back to definitions, you're going to want to add a definition for EV charging separately from gas station. In addition to that, there's kind of like sub-definitions that could also be added. So one option is to introduce level 2 versus level 3 direct current fast charging. Alternatively, as Justin discussed, you could also define AC charging versus DC charging, and that would kind of accomplish the same thing. The second set of definitions we would recommend you consider are adding definitions of a private charging station versus a publicly accessible station so that you can set some additional site design requirements for those publicly accessible stations. So after, updating definitions, the next thing we'd think about is updating your permitted use table to allow EV charging where appropriate. So when it comes to that slower level of AC charging, level 2 charging, generally we see that, as a permitted accessory use in all zoning districts. And, as Justin mentioned, that's because these stations don't really add a ton of range per hour, and they're not going to be a significant driver of traffic to a site. So usually they're at, retail, workplaces, other recreational areas, and, drivers are finding their way to them out of their normal routine, not kind of making a separate trip to use that level of charging. There's a little bit more variation that communities could pursue when it comes to level 3 charging. So again, part of it's going to depend on that level of power that the station has. When it comes to a lower level of power, that 50 kilowatts, a lot of communities will allow those as a permitted accessory use by right in zoning districts, since this is something that's going to complement maybe a grocery store, or it's going to be at an auto dealer, something like that. When you get into that higher power level, that's where you'll typically see additional restrictions on where level 3 charging can be located. So for example, some of those NEVI stations where that higher power level of charger is going to be the primary use of the site, often communities will set conditional restrictions on where they can be sited. So when it comes to level 3 charging, just to recap, this is something that your community will want to look at with your current zoning districts and kind of figure out what's the best solution for you. If there are areas where there's traffic restricted, or they're trying to generally limit drive-through restaurants, you might consider potentially restricting level 3 charging stations in those areas.
I'll mention real quick as well, with DC fast chargers, you are not going to see those in residential areas, right? Nobody's installing those at their house. I I don't know of anybody that ever would. Generally, you would typically see those in like a community service or community commercial, a type of district in that nature where retail or maybe office, but less likely. Gas stations, convenience stores, things of that nature. That's typically where those would want to go, and that's where they're typically cited. So these companies are not looking to put these necessarily in like office parks because they want the visibility. They want the same type of convenience that gas stations have. So it is not the case that you're likely to see that necessarily, but just be aware that it could potentially happen, and having a code aligned with that is a nice best practice.
Yeah, thank you, Justin, for that additional clarification. So yeah, going back to our kind of third barrier here, this would just be making sure that, it's clear in the code that parking that's for EVs, charging spaces, that these will count towards minimum parking requirements. Their charging stations are going to be an extra cost for property owners. And if there is kind of a disincentive to installing them, if they're going to need to add additional, parking spaces, that could potentially be a barrier to site owners adding them. So, what we generally see here is that communities should make it clear that any EV charging spaces will count towards those minimum parking requirements. On the other hand, if you want to be a little bit more ambitious in trying to encourage site owners to add EV charging, some cities will actually incentivize it by, having language in there that allows an EV charging space to count for additional parking spaces. So the city of Indianapolis is one example. They'll allow every EV parking space to count towards 2 of those required parking spaces. And then, yep, this is the last slide that we have in this section. So just going to pause again and see if there's any discussion or further questions.
Laura, I'm gonna chime in again. I apologize. A key thing
No,
about
please.
this on the charging infrastructure. So the way that these things are typically set up and the way that they're operated is that they're owned by the property owner, right? So the property owner sets the price of electricity, and they have the potential to make money off this. So there's an initial upfront capital cost that goes along, number one, with putting conduit in the ground, number two, with getting the charger in there. But if this is something that happens, it is not the case that that is an asset that is then lost in terms of value. So, hotels have it, retail has it, employers have it, where you go, you essentially set up an account with the network provider. That's like the charge point. They're the ones that operate the charger for the most part. The landowner sets the cost, they set the price, they set the policy. And so this is not like a loss leader for them where, it potentially is a requirement of the city, or it's something that is being addressed through zoning and it's a loss to them. It is something that they can actually recapture the value from monetarily and start basically at the moment that those assets are installed. And so everybody knows like the cost. I'm trying to think like Fargo-Moorhead area. I'm guessing the cost of electricity is probably around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. If you use a public charger, they could potentially charge anywhere from 15 cents a kilowatt hour, 20 cents, 30 cents, 35 cents, as high as I've seen it. And then again, kind of recapturing the cost of that infrastructure so it pays for itself, and then potentially making a profit off of it as well, and then covering the cost of operations and maintenance.
All right, if there's no additional questions, I'll move to the next section. Right, so this is going to be covering charging station design standards. So there's really a lot of site design elements, we could talk about, and we'll touch a little bit on, some of those broader elements at the end of this. But right now we're going to focus on 2 key elements, which are station accessibility and then station safety. So to date, the U.S. Access Board has published design recommendations for EV charging stations. It's a really great resource, but those recommendations are not actually a final rule yet. So actually at the end of September, the U.S. Access Board put forth proposed rules, and the comment period just closed this past Monday on November 4th. So just be on the lookout for kind of finalized rules in the next coming months as they go through those comments and finalize what their recommendations are for accessible spaces. But with that said, I'm going to go over what was in that proposal. So when it comes to the number of accessible charging spaces, the proposed rule right now is at least one EV charging space per every 25 EV charging spaces should be accessible. And this essentially follows the standard ADA requirements for number of accessible spaces. If there's less than 25 spaces provided, at least one of them should be accessible. And then as part of that recent proposal, the U.S. Access Board did put forth an alternative, which they're calling the use last alternative. And under this approach, those accessible EV spaces wouldn't be restricted, but there would need to be signage there that clarified they could only be used if no other charging spaces were available. So, with this rule, they're also proposing an increase in the number of required accessible spaces. So kind of whereas with that standard rule, it's one accessible space per every 25 spaces. Under the use last alternative, it would potentially be 2 accessible spaces per 25 spaces. And then some of those additional accessibility recommendations that have been published so far include, making sure that that vehicle charging space is 11 feet wide, 20 feet long, and that there's an adjoining access aisle, which is at least 5 feet wide. Additionally, that access aisle should have kind of a clear runway up to the charger and the connector so that, persons who are using a wheelchair are able to maneuver up. And then also making sure that the charger has accessible operable parts. And that would include making sure that the charger is accessible for people who are both auditory or visually impaired. And then again, just as a wrap up.
Last slide.
Sorry, return to the previous slide.
Accessibility part.
Sorry, return one slide previously.
Yeah, please.
Yes. Yep. Is there anything, any question on this or other details?
Just trying to wrap my head around this as far as the site planning review. Accessible would be not restricted, but should be used if no other spaces are available for handicap parking or by other people. I'm not quite sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, so I think first, right now, this also isn't a hard rule yet. It was just kind of included in that proposal. So I just wanted to kind of put it out to kind of make this group aware that this could potentially be the final rule. But, I think what this rule is trying to communicate is that if EV charging is provided, accessible spaces could be used by persons who do not have a disability. However, they should only be used last. And so kind of the reasoning behind this was that obviously there's going to be additional operations and maintenance costs for site owners who install this, potentially lost revenue as Justin talked about. So, in kind of issuing this alternative rule, the U.S. Access Board was trying to make sure that, site owners could kind of capture the maximum amount of number of users, but also ensure that there are accessible spaces, still reserved.
Got it. Thank you.
From a parking and site standpoint, one of the big challenges, right? So right now we've got standard parking spaces and we have ADA accessible spaces, right? There's our let's say our 2 classifications of spaces. We add EV chargers to the mix, then we have standard spaces, we have handicap spaces, and then we have EV charging spaces. And then you potentially have people that are handicapped and have an EV. So that adds a fourth where to use a space, you would have to both have an EV and have a handicap placard. And that is difficult in a lot of ways in terms of site design, in terms of enforcement, and in terms of just maximizing the utility of the infrastructure. That's why personally, like the use last, I think is a very good option because it accounts for handicap accessibility, but it does not do so at the exclusion of the use of that asset if there are not handicap folks that are available to use it, if that makes sense. And it's one of those things, if you got 4 chargers on site and one is handicap accessible, well, if there's not that that kind of profile of person that both has a placard and has an EV, then that space and that charger just never gets used. And that's why I think this is a very nice approach to kind of balancing those two considerations.
Yep. All right, I'll move back to the next slide unless we want to cover this a little more. All right, so think I covered everything here. So yep, these are the basically recommendations at this point. As I mentioned, just stay tuned. The comment period ended this past Monday, so probably in the next couple of months, you will see, final ruling on what that recommendation is going to be from the U.S. Access Board. Great. And then last topic here, there are additional safety considerations that are kind of best practice when it comes to all EV charging spaces, just, in addition to those accessible spaces. And the key topics we'd, want to cover here are adding dedicated lighting to charging spaces so that they can safely be used at night. Additionally, having contact information for when the station's not operational. That way qualified persons are called to come and do the troubleshooting. Details on the amperage and voltage of the station, adding high voltage warnings, things of that nature. Additionally, adding bollards, a curb stop, or other means of protection against vehicle collision is recommended, both to protect, vehicles as well as the charger. And then finally, ensuring that there's an emergency stop button or emergency call button as well on the charging station. And then just as a wrap up, so I know that we, covered just a small sliver of these, kind of those higher priority elements, which are, accessibility and safety, but just kind of wanted to highlight here that there are a lot of other elements that you can consider in terms of site design. Not all of these will necessarily be requirements that you place on stations, but we thought it'd be helpful to kind of just show this in case, any of your cities are considering installing additional municipally owned charging stations yourself. And then this is the last slide, so I will just pause here again if we want any further discussion on this topic. All right, moving on. Okay, next topic is going to be making your building codes EV ready. So this is really one of the best ways that a community can address that need for charging ports, especially at multifamily locations. There are 3 levels of EV ready building codes that I'm going to cover here. So the first and kind of lowest bar is EVSE capable. This is when there is sufficient panel capacity installed that would support level 2 charging, along with a dedicated circuit and raceway that runs from that panel to the parking stall. Kind of that mid-tier is going to be EVSE ready. This takes that readiness step one step further and requires that wiring terminate in a 240 volt outlet. And then the last one, EVSE installed. This would just be where the charger actually, the parking spot actually has a charger installed and ready for use. So, one of the reasons why it's really important to consider these requirements in your building code is that it's going to be a lot more cost effective to do this work during new construction rather than retrofit parking at a later stage. As you can see in the graph that we have there on the right, this is showing the cost to add EV capable requirements to a parking space. That kind of more blue-green, that's showing the cost for a parking space when the EV capable requirements are installed during new construction. That kind of more lime green bar, that's showing the additional cost during a retrofit. So as you can see, if it's if this is done at a later stage during a retrofit, there's a much more significant cost to that. So what we typically see recommended is that you would prioritize potentially a higher percent of EV capable spaces rather than a lower percent of EV ready or EV installed. And the reason for that is developers will probably be much more amenable to that kind of requirement because you're kind of asking for the smallest upfront investment, but you're also maximizing those future charging capabilities at that location. So if we talk about, different examples, the state of Illinois actually has a statewide building code mandate for this. It's called the Illinois Electric Vehicle Charging Act. And, they have a requirement that all large multifamily construction provides 100% EV capable parking. Smaller multifamily construction only needs to provide one EV capable space per unit if parking is provided. So that's a really ambitious measure that they've taken, asking for 100% EV capable parking. Oftentimes, communities will do a little bit less than that. So, I'm based in Madison, and the rule that we have here when it comes to EV ready building codes is multifamily properties need to provide 10% of parking spaces that are EV capable, and then an additional 1% need to be EV installed. So this is the last slide for this section. So again, just going to pause, see if there's any discussion or questions.
Or if you can move to the previous slide, if you wouldn't mind. One thing I want to mention, this is, I think, important for folks in the call to understand. These are all kind of different levels of policy decisions. So when we look at on the left-hand side, EV capable, it is fairly easy to do. And that's really putting conduit in the ground, stub ups for future build out of infrastructure. So it is doing it when it is cost effective to do so, like Laura mentioned. It can be a requirement. It could also be something that's kind of achieved in different ways. But as you move to the right, it becomes a bit more, I don't like the term aggressive, but I'll use the term aggressive, where you are requiring the installation of EV charging in parking lots. And so again, that's a policy decision. You might see a lot more of the right-hand side in places like San Jose. You might see a lot more on the left-hand side in places like Decatur, Illinois, or Fargo or Moorhead, if that makes sense. And so it's, to some extent, it's a bit of perception. It is kind of navigating what the development community is going to push back really hard on. It is something that, again, is a spectrum of kind of where you want to be at in terms of getting the infrastructure out there. Is it enough to lay the groundwork and hope that's something that happens at a future time, or is it something that you want to require on day one for the infrastructure to be there?
All right, I will move to our final topic. Okay, and then finally, that kind of last high priority strategy that was identified in the study was adding a density bonus for multifamily developers. So, along with that building code requirement that you could potentially add, a density bonus is just kind of like that next level to encourage investment in charging. So, it works really well for new development. If you want to encourage EV charging to be added to existing development, obviously the density bonus isn't going to have much of an effect since it's already built. And what we'll see cities do in that situation is often to offer like a rebate or financial incentive to help offset some of the costs for charging stations. So I've just pulled here some of the language that two cities have used that do have a density bonus for EV charging. The first is Norcross, Georgia. It's a suburb of Atlanta. So in one of their districts, they will offer an additional 10% density bonus for multifamily if in 5% of the parking spaces, EV charging is provided with a minimum of 5 charging stations. And then the other example I pulled here is out of Quincy, Washington. And this applies to planned developments within the city. So they will offer a maximum bonus of 10% residential space if EV charging is incorporated into the proposed development. They're a little bit less clear there on the number of spaces that need to be provided, but also still just adding that incentive there for multifamily developers. And this is actually the last slide we have. So yeah, happy to, kind of go back to any previous sections if we want to have a further discussion.
I think your content's really good. I'm just, not, we haven't had an application in my short tenure here at West Fargo that has had one proposed. So I'm just not sure what that looks like. And I'm trying to think of other fuel stations that I've visited on in my journeys, and seems there to be a lot of opportunities for co-locations, and but you brought up some really good points, so I appreciate the content.
Leslie, we hope to get you some DCFC NEVI proposals pretty soon.
Okay. Sounds good.
That's the hope.
I guess I don't really understand the, from a site planning standpoint too, in a site reviewing standpoint, um, the co-location aspect of it, the safety distance requirements between the gas fueling stations versus the standalone EV stations, if that's something that can't be located, adjoining each other, those kind of the nuance. I kind of get into the weeds really fast with these in my head, so apologies. I know that's not the content of this application, but you are the expert, so there has to be a best practices application, I would imagine.
No, that's a good point. On the DCFC side and NEVI, I can tell you at least on the nationwide level, the types of site hosts that we're seeing, number one, are fueling retailers, right? So everybody knows NEVI is intended for corridors. So in North Dakota, it's only 29 and 94. Right now, Minnesota is in the process of contracting and building out 94, 35, and then potentially 90 as well. So that's really, and it requires those chargers to be located no more than 1 mile from those corridors and be built no more than 50 miles apart. So those guys have a requirement of 150 kilowatts a port, and you have to have at least 4 ports. So these are fairly expensive. In rural areas, it's just going to cost more. So the cost is going to be anywhere from a federal side, 700,000 up to $1 million for federal reimbursements. And they have to keep them running or operational for about 5 years as part of the program. So, the areas that are potential for siting within the Fargo-Moorhead region are really going to be a mile away from 29 and 94. And for the most part, a majority of these are awarded to fueling stations because the way that not the requirements, the scoring in both of these states are written is like access to restrooms, 24 hours is preferable, lighting, having on-site staff, emergency communications, things like that. It's set up really well to go towards those. The next one down is hotels, typically, that we see. The one after that is going to be retail, and then finally is restaurants. So it's kind of the top four of where these typically go. And part of that is just what are the commercial areas that are around the interchanges along interstates that are less than a mile away. And they're already built to do this. So it's a good fit. Related to your question about spacing, off the top of my head, I don't know. I think that's more of a fueling retailer kind of question. However, that is an answer that I would actually be curious to find out. And Leslie, I can get back with you on that if that's okay.
That's fine. I mean, even this picture that's on the screen, it spikes my curiosity. A typical fueling station would have an island, right? And would be, even though these have, let's just say, a minimum of you're going to use 20 minutes of your time to charge a vehicle, the loading, unloading action of pulling through it versus the parking, sitting, backing up, you know, I just find it just a little fascinating um,
Yeah. So a couple things.
about
Oops.
behaviors.
Yeah.
I'll also tell you, like, my only real firsthand person experience with people who have these electric vehicles maybe are that my brother had a Leaf and also is a Prius driver, and he worked for ASU, and it was one thing we haven't touched on, and it isn't even a zoning requirement, and I don't know if it needs to be, but when my brother was parking at the ASU campus, his greatest source of frustration were the people who were using the EV spaces as parking stalls and camping there all day, where those people who need charges were not able to access them. So that's kind of something that's probably more of an operations and a city ordinance or, parking regulation type thing that's going to be managed. But again, thinking ahead of these, like, once you pull in, you park, how can anybody else get it versus if it was a pull through, someone still might be able to stretch a cord to access it. But
It's where
just small talk, just thinking out loud. So
yeah, no, and I appreciate that. So the one that you see on screen, that's a level two, and those are consider them add-ons to parking spaces is a way to think about it.
mhm.
And part of the difficulties with EVs is it kind of changes your conception for fueling. Because right now we go to very specific points throughout cities or interchanges or interstates and conduct a 7-minute exercise to fill up our gas tanks. EVs are different because number one, you can do it at your house. And every morning you could potentially have your vehicle filled up. So to some extent, it kind of reduces the need for certain types of chargers, but also you could have them at places of employment. And so the ones that you see on screen, again, those are really kind of think of them as enhancements to existing parking areas. And then when we get into the fast chargers, I agree with you. And that's one thing that we try to do in the North Dakota NEVI is to prioritize pull through parking. The difficulty with it is that most of the proposers on these are existing fueling stations, so they're really trying to shoehorn them in to the existing site.
Right.
So they'll kind of prioritize like areas on the fringes of their parking areas. Number one, where they can fit the equipment. Number two, where they can kind of stay out of the way of their existing operations. Sometimes they'll put kind of coverings over them or the awnings. I think you're going to see more and more that are just developed like typical fueling stations. And in places like the Bay Area, they're actually doing indoor, which it sounds cool to me. I mean, you think of like an old abandoned like retail space.
Mhm.
These are zero emissions, so you can literally pull it inside of a building and have your fueling outside of the elements altogether and have a lounge. I'm not saying that's anything part of the NEVI program or that we would ever see it. I'm in Ohio. Like I probably won't see that in Ohio in a long time, and I would doubt you would see that in North Dakota for a while as well. But it is something that it is possible. I think there's a lot of struggle just kind of understanding the new dynamics of this related to how we typically view fueling internal combustion versus what is now possible with EV charging. And so I think there's a lot that's still trying to be worked out and how to best facilitate that.
Thank you. That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
All right. If there isn't any further discussion or questions at this time, I guess we can wrap it up. Or John, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add about the project.
Yeah, this is probably a good spot to just mention that again, we're limited on how long we could take this project, and so we um, wanted to get this meeting together so we could talk about an important topical area. Again, we want to continue to be a good partner in this space. So Justin and Laura, if you are seeing this live or on video, take down their information. They're great answers to questions. But the study itself is likely to get final over to the MetroCog in this next week, and then be in the packet for a yet 2024 policy meeting. And with that, we are expecting a lot of folks to, be able to have like 4-page or less brochure style um, uh, study summary. And so if you guys, having been on the SRC and, you're still having questions of folks that are, in your management or of your kind of constituents, we're hoping that this is a nice, easy place to keep study results. And then if that were to lead to any of these questions about how do we do some of these high target strategies, again, the study will have been concluded, but feel free to reach out to Justin or Laura. They love to help answer your question.